quickly describe what the strategic vision is setting up.
The
first thing is that the strategic approach is something that is totally relevant. And we should see the world with 3 levels: competition, dispute, confrontation. Competition is a normal way of operating. We see it every day. And it's some competition in all domains: cultural, economic, sports, of course, and of course, military or in security issues. So for me, this competition situation is, if you like, already a war before the war. The second step is the dispute. That's when one of the competitors thinks he can grab an opportunity and impose his will by imposing a fait accompli. And Crimea is a good example of dispute where the Russians imposed the fait accompli by, of course, using hybrid strategies in order to prevent the intervention of the other competitors. So this is a war just before the war. Now, the confrontation is, of course, when a competition and a dispute phase has finished, and one of the adversaries is escalating the situation more or less swiftly, which ends up in a more or less generalized confrontation, and in the end you have the war. And the war is what you can see nowadays in Ukraine. So what we can see is that with this approach, it seems that for our countries, we absolutely need this. So the strategy of the French army now is to win the war before the war, as soon as the competition phase on, and to be able to win this competition phase, we need to be credible and to have forces that are able to commit themselves, actually. But the effort has to be done during the competition phase.
Thank you for that, sir. Those distinctions resonate with a lot of the ways that the U.S. military is also thinking about the competitive space and the sort of different types of conflict and competition that are going on all the time. Clearly, we want to be able to strengthen deterrence and to avoid disputes or outright war whenever possible. Your strategic vision was entitled, it had 2030 in the title, which suggests that we had a certain amount of time to prepare to put in place these changes to actually avoid disputes and win the pre-conflict or the competition phase. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated that the threat might be more urgent and that we might not have that amount of time to make preparations. What are your plans in the near term to improve the French forces' preparedness for high-intensity conflict?
You're right. The strategic vision was designed for 2030, but this strategic vision belongs to the strategic review that was done in 2017 that would provide the country with the necessity to be able to confront powerful states by 2030. So, you know, there's a military programming law that was set up in 2019 for 5 years, which was a first step, and then be able, with the next step, to be prepared, fully prepared in 2030 to face powerful states. The first programming law was 2019-2025 is pretty new because the budgets were very much increased, 300 billion euros for the French defense. But I think that the military is aware that to build up forces so that we can fight against other states requires a huge effort. And this was the case for the French army, who had been committed in wars against terrorist groups for 20 years, which are hard conflicts because they are slowly suffer in these conflicts. But however, we realize that there is true difference of level between carrying out these operations and being able today to wage wars between states. And high-intensity conflict is a true different scale compared to counterinsurrection or counterterrorism operation that we have carried out in the 20 last years. So I think it doesn't mean that we are not ready today to engage in a high-intensity conflict. We would do this with the asset that we have now. But this ambition, for me, is requires time. And of course, we need to improve our equipment, modernize our equipment. That's what we're doing with the Scorpion program for the French Army, with new ships, warships for the Navy, with the extension of the Rafale fighter for the Air Force. But this is not something we can do within very quickly. So then we need to be able to train the units for high-intensity conflicts. And there are some soldiers who are listening to me now, and the researchers and know what operations are like. You know, it's very complicated to carry out operations against terrorist groups, but the dimension in a high-intensity conflict is totally different. And we do not only need to train at company level, but at battalion, brigade, division, and army corps level. And this is something that requires time, because this is a very complicated issue. And I realize that when you have a look at the Russian army and their current operations, they clearly are not that ready to carry out high-intensity operations, and they are lacking some seamlessness. There's lack of initiative with the units in the front. Maybe the artillery supports and as synchronous as it should be with the airstrikes. So I think that it's not really a surprise, because this is something that requires huge efforts, and that's why you probably saw it, that the French army came to train at the strike factor with the US Army, with the US division, a UK division, and a French division for over a month on a high-intensity Army Corps level conflict. And that's what the track we should follow now. And thinking that we could be prepared again for high intensity in short deadlines is not possible. It is very complicated. And again, it doesn't mean that we're not able right now to be engaged in high intensity conflicts, but not with all the assets that we have identified at the level of training we expect to reach by 2030. Of course, the situation today shows it that we need to speed up the process, but let us not lie to ourselves, because that would not be honest. And that's what the intervention in Ukraine by the Russian army is showing negatively. This is something that requires a lot of efforts and a lot of time.
That is clearly true, that the scale is different, and that we're also seeing that potential adversaries like Russia are having challenges with large operations and fighting in a modern combined arms way that many would have expected. Balancing these different time pressures and what you can do now versus what we can do in the future. I want to talk a little bit more about the future, but before I get to that, we have a question from Aaron, and that wanted your impressions and thoughts on the idea of whether an American-Polish deal to give Ukraine some of Poland's old Russian-made aircraft makes sense. This is one of these near-term opportunities to bolster Ukraine's capabilities that can be done quickly. Do you think that that's a good idea, sir?
First thing, the support of France, but also of NATO and Europe to Ukraine is something that is very strong, that is on a voluntary basis, very voluntaristic actually, but everybody understands that we cannot become co-belligerents, and this is the thin line, the thin thread we are walking on. More precisely, but should we help Ukraine? Of course we have to. Should we provide them with weapons? Yes, we have to do this. We have to do this in a reasonable way, and we have to be careful to keep a level of visibility and of will that is mastered. Let me explain this. We can do many things. We are not compelled to do too much communication and publicity about this. This is something that the Russians are totally understand, and they have not forbidden us. They are forbidden from us from providing Ukraine with weapons. Ukraine is also allowed to purchase weapons, like Russia is doing it. So, but the support that is brought by European countries and NATO is something that needs to be done, but not necessarily communicated upon and become a tool of communication. So we shouldn't communicate too much about this.
There's certainly concerns about escalation and, remaining supportive of Ukraine, which is a partner, and defending NATO allies, which France has done made very strong statements and gestures in that direction. France had come out and offered to send forces to Romania previously. There are already French forces in Estonia as a part of the enhanced forward presence. Do you expect the French presence in Eastern Europe to grow soon?
Concerning the French commitment within NATO to contribute to the deterrence and defense maneuver, this is a very strong involvement of France, and you have mentioned it. Starting with the air component, with regular contribution of the French Air Force in air defense missions in the Baltic states. Currently, this is something that we've made progress on. We are actually in advance, and we are able to multiply by 2 the number of fighters. There were already some Belgian fighters, and we are setting up 4 additional French fighters before taking the mission in our own hands. Very quickly, when the invasion of Ukraine started, the French Air Force, in the framework of the build-up and the strengthening of the air defense on the line above Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, has committed at least 2 air patrols of fighters, Rafale fighters, with air fueling aircraft above Poland under NATO command. We have also included in this mission fighters from the Navy group, from the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, which is located in the Adriatic Sea, together with a Truman U.S. aircraft carrier, to set up every day 2 air patrols above Romania. We are also carrying out electronic warfare missions that are coordinated with those of NATO in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. That's the air layout. Concerning the maritime Navy layout, beside the Navy group we have in the Adriatic Sea, we have a group of ships in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, especially in the Suez Canal, to control the outlet of the Black Sea and also the activities in Syria. Concerning the land forces, we have the exercise being carried out in Norway in the framework of a visibility and strategic visibility by the VGTF, that is the Rapid Action Force of NATO, and the exercise Brian John. There are above 2,700 soldiers involved in this, and this is carried out by Secure. For several years, we have been involved in the EFP mission in Lithuania and Estonia. We were supposed to complete our deployment of 1 year, but we are currently being relieved by a Danish company. We have decided to maintain a company for an indefinite period of time in order to double our presence in this phase. So this is a true strategic solidarity with the Estonians. So our presence is very important in that framework within a battalion that is currently under British command, and their training and deterrence level is really high. Finally, Secure asked how to deploy forces swiftly in Romania, and in that framework he asked for the deployment of the VGTF battalion, the spearhead battalion. So that was the highest alert level. So we deployed within less than 7 days a battalion of 500 men, which is being complemented with a Belgium company of some 200 men. So that's a battalion with 700 men. It was deployed by strategic airlift with 40 rotations of strategic airlift aircraft, and it's being deployed in Romania, getting in touch with, taking contact with the Romanian forces to be embedded in their defense plan in order to deter or to defend the NATO borders. So this is to sum up the deployment and the involvement, the commitment of the French armed forces in the permanent, reinforced, enhanced presence of NATO.
Thank you for that, sir. I wasn't aware of the extent to which French forces were involved across these different activities in Europe. It's truly impressive, especially when we think about all of the other global commitments. But before we turn to that, I want to talk a little bit about return to the strategic vision and think about your plans for transforming the French armed forces and your modernization plans. What would you say are your top 3 priorities over the next 8 years in terms of being able to realize the transformation that you've undertaken?
Alors, en ce qui concerne les priorités.
What are our priorities?
Check. Alors, je pense que les priorités, si on peut les... Ça n'a pas été
priorities,
identifié comme ça, mais si je fixe 3
they were not really identified as such, but the first priority, I think that for the French armed forces, we need to recover a true capability to think at a strategic level. It is probably a mistake, but the wars and kind of limited wars in Afghanistan or Iraq, they're not really required to analyze at a strategic level. It's probably a mistake, and we can see some consequences right now. So we really truly need to be able to have a strategic approach of the situation. Our adversaries, our enemies are doing that. So this is essential. For me, this requires 2 aspects: to have a strategic overview, to recover a true capability to anticipate on the various theaters of operation, Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali. It's not really capability to anticipate. You always have the initiative, and this is not something that is lethal danger if we have missed something. But if we're not able to anticipate what's going to happen, and not able to take measures to anticipate, we might lose against a true strong enemy. So, and that's where we need to develop a true strategic solidarity. We have the alliances, which is collective defense, but we need to have true strategic solidarities that are set up with our allies. The second thing is, with the rearming of many countries, development of very powerful weapons that can reach very far in depth, we need to be able to deter them from firing these weapons, and we need to think differently, and we should not always answer in a direct way to the threat that we are facing. Acting and thinking differently also means to be able to detect and not fall into the trap that is set by our competitors or adversaries who are trying to lead us into this trap. So we should not be acting at the place where they want us to act. The third point, I think this is quite interactive. We need to make a huge effort in immaterial fields, that is to say, the war of perceptions, to better synchronize, improve the synchronization, information war, and kinetic actions. This is something on which the French armed forces need to make a huge effort, and I'm realizing that the Ukrainian army is really well prepared for information, the war information. They are imposing their narrative to the Russian army and to Russia, and actually to the whole world who is witnessing this. We need to learn a lot on the way the Ukrainian army is playing in the immaterial field and in the war of perceptions. I think there is a feedback, lessons learned that we need to analyze. So for me, the immaterial field, this is probably the main shift on which we have to be able to get involved fully.
That all makes a lot of sense, sir. It's clearly sort of deeper than just changing the equipment that you have. There's a cultural shift, a mindset shift in terms of being prepared to fight a capable thinking adversary, developing competitive strategies that needs to happen. As I looked at the plan that you've laid out for the next 5 years, there's some interesting differences that stood out to me compared to what you've seen other countries like the United Kingdom or the United States, what they're planning on doing. The UK shrinking its force and reducing its investment in heavy ground forces, but your strategy actually emphasizes the role of ground troops and armor. Can you discuss the rationale for this? And as a part of it, can you provide an update on the Scorpion program?
I read with a lot of interest the strategic review that was carried out by the British Army. There's a lot of interesting stuff that is not totally different from what the French Army is doing. So if we read carefully, we are following kind of parallel ways. I would say there are two differences. You underline one, which is indeed the British decision to shrink the heavy forces, but the other one is to make an effort on the immaterial fields, and the British Army has really high skills in that field, and the effort they're making makes sense, and we need to do this too. Concerning the heavy sector, I think it's not I'm not criticizing that, but what is making the difference between the French and British armies is that for the French army, the commitment in a high-intensity conflict is planned to be done in a coalition. So in the framework of a collective commitment with our allies. So that's how we have dimensioned our army. But we, for the French army, for the child that I am of the French army, the French armed forces, I should never be in a situation where I need to see the President of the Republic as the Chief of the Armed Forces and tell him, sir, I'm sorry, I cannot do anything. It would be much more complicated than in a coalition. Probably will be much more complicated, and I think that that is something that is really essential. And in that field, I think that if the French army wants to remain credible, which is important to win the war before the war, but to be able to be committed, we need to have armies that are credible and also have a heavy component in order to be able to deter, but we need to make an effort to increase our volume in that field. And I think this is also something that is important if we have a true will to want to be a framework nation. It's very difficult to be a framework nation if you are not able to set up a command structure with a support structure. If you're not able as a framework nation to put some armor or to put some decisive forces that will be in the midst of the engagement, the commitment, you will not be credible. And France might be a framework nation, so we need also to have in the air, in maritime and land field, we need to have the capability to have comprehensive assets, including armor. And we would, if we didn't have that, we would waste our credibility, and that's how the posture, the format and organization of the French armed forces is planned. Now, concerning the Scorpion program, which is a program of modernization of the army, this is something that aims at digitalizing all land forces in order to be able to exchange information very quickly, but also to improve the operational pace and able to be able to impose our will on the opponent. If I can go a bit into details and give you an example, it's a bit like if the vehicles that we're developing now, like the Griffon, which is an infantry fighting vehicle, or the Serval, which is a bit lighter vehicle for medium-sized brigades, the future combat battle tank. These are our current smartphones, for smartphones of today. Like you cannot have any kind of aggression with a phone, but it's an ability to share and transmit information. So this is something that is providing some good results. But for the smartphone to work well, we need to have the 5G and the ticket system, which is the CF system, which is the communications and information system that is currently being set up. We have already deployed in the Saharan Strip in Mali. We have a battalion that is equipped with Griffon vehicles, and they are equipped with the CF communication system. We had some great results, even if for me this is not in a war. This is not in counterterrorism that it can show the best results it can provide. But we're using it at company, battalion level, and at brigade level. There is a true transformation in the way we conduct operations and with better seamlessness and capability to better survive on a battlefield. The survivability of the units, especially of command posts, is something we need to be very vigilant on, and the use of the Scorpion plan system, both by the new vehicles with the powerful aggression and communication sensors, with the whole CF bubble that connects all of them, is a true driver.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that, and it sounds very familiar to what we've heard in the United States military with either all-domain operations or joint all-domain command and control, where you're trying to link up forces from different domains and make sure that they're passing information in a way to gain an advantage on the battlefield. Do you anticipate that France's networks and like the Scorpion digitization program will be interoperable with NATO and American systems so that they can actually operate seamlessly together?
You're right. Interoperability is something that is essential. Interoperability starts at the communication level. The military has a decisive role in that field. The weapons industry, weapon manufacturers need to build systems that are compatible because the soldiers who will use this on the field, if they're not able to speak in a simple way, they will not be able to use it. Having great equipment is something you understand, but the most important thing is to be able to have a system that we can exchange with. But we need to massively develop a communication system that talk with each other. It's not the case nowadays. So this is something on which the military need to impose, that the systems are able to talk to each other. It's not only the case of the French armies who are facing this and witnessing this deployment in some European NATO countries of the F-35, which is posing some problems. And the F-35 is designed as a really very effective, efficient system, has great qualities, but it's designed as a very closed system. And that, I think this is a mistake, because the systems that are deployed within NATO countries have to be deployed to be compatible with the other systems in use within NATO. So we need to make sure that they are compatible and interoperable in a very massive ways. I think we're not making progress in the right direction in that field.
That is concerning. It's certainly something that needs to be addressed in the near term. One last question, sort of focused on Europe before we turn to Africa and the Indo-Pacific, because we've had some questions there, and I know we want to cover some of your activities in those regions. From Patrick, he asked what your advice would be about the level and scope of military assistance that NATO members should be providing to Ukraine self-defense forces. If aircraft are too escalatory, where's the red line? Is it unmanned aerial vehicles like the ones that Turkey provides, land attack anti-ship missiles? What do you think is appropriate and not risky?
About this topic, my own feeling is that today there are no true embargo measures that were declared against the belligerents, neither for the Russians nor for the Ukrainians. So it makes sense, it's not abnormal that Ukraine can still receive weapons. And that's what Russia is also doing. So they still acquire ammunition and weapons. But I think that our objective is to help Ukraine and to keep our level of commitment and the risk to become involved in the war at the lowest possible level. So this is something that needs to be done directly with Ukraine, but it is important in terms of communication to remain as the most unobtrusive as possible. And the Russians can accept a certain number of things, but they cannot accept that we overtly support Ukraine. Where is the red line? I think it depends on our smartness. The less we say it, the more we can do. We need to remain very unobtrusive about this and avoid any kind of provocation that could come from either belligerent.
Okay, let's turn our attention to Africa, and this is another area where there's been a lot of transition and change in the last few months. Last year, France announced that it was ending its longstanding counterterrorism operation in the Sahel. And then in February, just last month, it was announced that you're withdrawing all of your forces from Mali, which has been one of your critical nodes within West Africa. Can you discuss your plans for your military posture in the West African region and how you are going to conduct counterterrorism operations going forward?
First, I think It's not a withdrawal of the French forces or disengagement. It's first we need to continue the fight against terrorism because there are still terrorist groups. We need to rearrange our layout because nowadays the political conditions, especially in Mali, are not met anymore. They are not met anymore because, first, the Malian government is not a legitimate government. It has been set up with a coup, and it is refusing to respect the transition that should bring it to election that should have taken place in February. So this is a true problem of legitimacy of the government with which we're supposed to be working. And you totally understood that Russia has deployed a group of mercenaries, Wagner, not to name it, that is fighting in direct support of the Malian forces. The Malian forces with which we are cooperating to conduct combat operations. We cannot accept to work with the Malians together with who are still working together with a group of mercenaries. We have seen them acting in Central Africa. We are monitoring the situation. We know the high level of violence that is occurring over there, but with the counterproductive effects on the country itself. Central Africa nowadays, Mali in the close future, the effect of predation. They are stealing resources. Wagner is a company. They need to make money. So that's by stealing resources in the country that they can make money. And they do this in one of the poorest countries in the world. It's not to build up the Malian or Central African army, because once they are autonomous, they will not need Wagner anymore. So of course that's not how a company that needs to make money will work. So Wagner, by using small groups of soldiers, not within the structures that are designed for that, not with soldiers who have been trained, they are going against the possibility for these armies to gain their autonomy. But the autonomy of African countries is the only solution to fight and win against terrorism in Africa. It's not the commitment of foreign armies that will defeat terrorism in Africa or anywhere else. Of course, the farmer in a village in Mali, if he had to choose between the terrorist group and a French or Swedish soldier, or, I don't know, Italian soldier, he will immediately understand that the terrorist is the one who will stay longer. So if we want to have a chance for the farmer or the villager not to be defeated by terrorists, only his national army will be able to defeat the terrorists. So this goes through developing the autonomy of these African armies. Wagner goes against this. And that's the reason for which the President of the Republic decided it was not possible anymore to fight against terrorism in Mali. But the fight against terrorism is continuing, and especially by supporting both countries, Niger or Burkina Faso, that are decisive in this fight, and we're already engaged in these countries. But there is a second main axis, main effort, which is to improve and accelerate, speed up the support we are providing to the African countries of the Gulf of Guinea. They are already beginning to feel the pressure, the buildup of terrorist groups to the south. So it's now the time to help them, so that they very quickly gain their own autonomy and be able to fight these terrorist groups by themselves before the threat becomes too strong against them. The very condition for this to work is for the Western armies, and especially the French army, and even the countries, is to be able to understand how now we can change the way we are present in Africa. And we need to be able to provide what the countries need and not what we think they should take. I think this is one of the aspects that our action can be criticized. they do not have what they know that they need. And we will never transform the Malian or Nigerian or Burkinabe army in a NATO army. That's a total illusion. These guys will never be able to cope with us. We can need them in the support we provide them. We need to provide them with what they need to embed, to integrate, and with which they can be very strong. To me, this is the true challenge. Of course, the rearrangement of our layout, of course, will be done in different ways, but we need to develop a capability to change the way we are present, and this will require from us a true change in our habits and a new approach, the ability to think together, to build together with the African countries, the European countries, with France, the way we want to be present in Africa in a new way, and this is the major challenge. We have a few months ahead to talk together. There are some working groups that have been set up, planning groups, and we need at least 2 or 3 months to be able to find the right plan that it will not be able to be implemented in a block, but this is the only way. We need to improve their autonomy and to win their fight against terrorism. In that field, there's another thing that is important. That's communication and influence. And of course, it's not enough to have European French armed forces that fight well along African countries, and it's the case in Mali. It's important to keep good relationships with the Malian army, but what we need is that these countries and armies are able to explain to their population why a foreign army has come here upon their request, their government, to help them. We need to help the African countries to do this, and this is something that is essential.
So to take a now defunct American defense term, let's pivot to the Indo-Pacific quickly. I've had a couple of questions from Brian and Mark on this region, and we're running short on time. I want to leave you a couple of minutes to offer some concluding thoughts. So I'm going to group these together here. We know that France is an Indo-Pacific power. You have territories from the Indian Ocean to the Southwest Pacific. Brian wants to know what you see as the French military's role in the Indo-Pacific, given the new situation in Europe. And Mark had asked whether the French Navy would continue to be operating in that region. I know they have in the past. There was a quad exercise that I believe the French Navy led last year, or in the spring of last year. Do you anticipate to be able to make those type of commitments, given that you have large commitments to European defense, to Africa? What do you see going forward in the Indo-Pacific region?
Concerning the Indo-Pacific region, France has its own interests in this Indo-Pacific region. France has about over 1 million of square kilometers of exclusive economic interest zones. I think it's 1.2 million people with a French passport, New Caledonia, the Réunion, the French Polynesia, and we have a military presence, about 7,000 soldiers in these 3 areas. So France has its own economic, military, cultural interest in these areas. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that France, of course, is fully committed in the will to have its values being respected, freedom of movement on the sea, in the air, but also concerning the governance. So France knows it has to be involved in this. France must do this with its allies and coordinate. But there are some facts that are imposed on us when we look at the world in a concentric way. Of course, the Indo-Pacific area is very far from Europe. very far from France. So we need to be aware of this, and we cannot believe that we're able to have a presence in that area that is as strong as it is in our European continent area. But we need to play a major role, especially in this competition phase. We need to assert our will in coordination with our allies, of course, and with our American ally, who is our major ally, of course, but also with Australia, which is one of the biggest countries in the Indo-Pacific area. We need to coordinate with them and with the other European countries. Now, it's pretty clear that during dispute or confrontation phases, and it's quite obvious, I think nobody is surprised, for the French army, committing a force on the Indo-Pacific theater is something that is not really realistic for two reasons. As I told you, because of the distance, because that would require huge logistic and strategic deployment capabilities to be deployed efficiently in that area. We cannot play a major role in case of confrontation. We don't deploy heavy equipment. So the second reason for which it's not realistic is that if the situation is becoming tense and we need to confront an adversary in the Indo-Pacific region, I do not believe any second that the situation will not deteriorate in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, or in the Atlantic. And most probably, most of the U.S. assets will be moved to the area of confrontation, and we'll need to commit our own assets. So it makes sense to distribute the roles and missions in the world in case of a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific area. So there's no will of not being present, my friends. We need to be able to act in a coordinated way with our European, Australian, and American allies. But let's be clear, this is something that is very far away, where we need to be able to defend our interests. And we need to do this collectively. And this could not be a theater of operation that would be a major one for us. But we already have some forces that are permanently deployed over there. We are working on being able to deploy air assets quickly. We train to be able to deploy a group of 7 to 8 Rafale fighters with air fuelers in order to be able to carry operation in the Indo-Pacific area. But it cannot be the highest priority and cannot be done as a major engagement.
That makes a lot of sense to me. You need to prioritize, and there is the tyranny of distance. We're about out of time here, so I wanted to offer you the opportunity to offer a few concluding remarks before we sign off.
I think if I may conclude with some words, I think that the world, as it is changing now in a very swift way, it shows we need to be able to work together and to avoid ambiguous stances and approaches. I haven't seen all the questions, but I think there's a true topic about European defense and the defense of Europe, and in that field we need to be able to work about the European defense and NATO. This is a wrong fight. For Europeans, collective defense is first and foremost NATO, and this is something that is very important. It's NATO first with the Americans. No single European country, I think, believes that if one day we need to go into a fight, and this is something we should not exclude. No country is saying that the Americans cannot be with us. They need to be with us, and this is something that is very important. However, I think for France and all the European countries, we cannot also say that if for some kind of reason the Americans cannot or do not want to get involved, then we will not be able to do anything. And that's the reason why Europe also has to develop its own capabilities, not to substitute for NATO or a collective defense that would include the Americans, but to be sure that if one day the Americans cannot be there, then Europe would still be able to defend itself. And this is something I think is very important, and we should not oppose European defense and NATO. They are very much connected, and NATO is being reinforced when the European defense is reinforcing itself. That's the thing. Second thing, strategic solidarity is something that we need to develop, and the military have a true role to play in that field. We need to develop relationships between the countries, and I often give the example of the way France has set up a true strategic relationship and with Estonia, and still consolidating it with Romania. These are no exclusive strategic solidarities. Conversely, they are open, and they should allow to develop interoperability, efficiency, and ability to be engaged together with other allies. Now, concerning the situation in Ukraine, I think the situation is very serious. A country decided to wage an open war against another one to impose its will. It's the first time since 1945. We are learning that to do peace, we need to be two, but to wage a war, only one is enough. And this is something we need to protect ourselves against. And our forces are here to be ready, to be committed, and to defend the values and the interests of our country. And this is what France is trying to do, is fully involved. France knows it has to be done in a collective way, and we know we can rely on the really high cohesiveness of all the European countries. But we're monitoring the situation in Ukraine. I think that the problem is that the Russian army is facing against Ukraine is something that is really good. And I think that we should all show our admiration to what the Ukrainian army is doing in a very courageous way. The more the Russians will face difficulties, the more dangerous the situation will become. So the connection, the links need to be kept.
Thank you, sir, for those concluding remarks. We've had clearly the world faces a large number of serious security challenges today, and we've covered a number of them. I've really enjoyed and learned a lot from hearing your perspective, and enjoyed our conversation. So thank you for joining me here.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. We did not have time to go deeply into all topics, but I can see that your think tank is very proactive in developing a lot of stuff. We didn't have time to talk about wargaming, because this is something we should develop and better use. We should develop a gaming lab. And this is very interesting. If I come to the US, I will, of course, be very much interested in checking on this.
That would be great, sir. Please do so. Have a good afternoon, everyone, or evening.